Silas Thorne hadn't heard the sound of a human voice in 6 months. In the high country of Montana, silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's a weight. It's a living thing that sits on your shoulders and reminds you of every mistake you ever made. Silas lived in a cabin built of cedar and regret, perched on the edge of a world that didn't want him. He had his horses, a dog with a torn ear, and a Winchester that never missed. Well, before we'll continue this beautiful folk story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It's help us and keep the story burning. Now let's begin. It was mid-November, the kind of afternoon where the sky turns the color of a fresh bruise. The wind was coming off the peaks, sharp enough to shave with. Silas was out by the woodpile, his axe swinging in a steady, rhythmic crack. The smell of pine. Crack. The puff of his own breath in the freezing air. Then the dog growled. It wasn't the growl he gave for a mountain lion or a stray wolf. This was low, uncertain. Silas straightened his back, his joints popping like dry kindling. He squinted into the white haze of the rising drifts. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. A ghost made a spindrift. But then he saw the horse, a fine-blooded bay, lathered in sweat despite the sub-zero temperatures, its chest heaving, and on its back, a shape that didn't belong in the wilderness. She wasn't wearing buckskin or wool. She was draped in silk and velvet, a deep midnight blue that stood out against the snow like blood on a wedding dress. She wasn't holding the reins. She was clinging to the pommel, her body slumped forward, her face buried in the mane. Silas dropped the axe. He didn't think. He didn't wonder about the danger. He just moved. By the time he reached the gate, the bay horse had given up. Its legs buckled. Silas caught her before she hit the ice. She was small, smaller than the heavy layers of her dress made her seem. Her skin was the color of skimmed milk, blue-veined and translucent. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Silas looked back at the trail she'd left, a single, wavering line coming from south. No wagon, no escort, just a woman in a ballroom dress, riding toward the end of the world. He hoisted her into his arms. She was freezing, but under the silk, her body was rigid, vibrating with a tension he couldn't understand. "Easy now," Silas muttered. His own voice sounded like grinding stones in his ears. "I've got you." He carried her toward the cabin, the wind howling behind them as if it were trying to snatch her back. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Silas laid her down on his cot, the one covered in heavy buffalo robes. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had patched up wounded soldiers in the mud of Virginia. He built up the fire until the stove glowed cherry red. He boiled water. He waited for her to wake. But she didn't wake. Not exactly. She began to thrash. Her hands, gloved in fine lace that was now shredded and bloodied, clawed at her own throat. Her face, beautiful in a sharp, desperate way, turned a terrifying shade of gray. "Can't." She wheezed. Her eyes snapped open, but they weren't seeing Silas. They were seeing a nightmare. "Can't breathe." Silas leaned over her. "Miss, you're safe. Slow your heart." "No!" she gasped, her back arching off the cot. "Too tight. It's too tight. Please." She grabbed Silas's forearm, her grip surprisingly strong. She was suffocating. He realized, and it wasn't just the cold or the exhaustion. It was the dress. It was a masterpiece of city cruelty, a gown designed for a parlor, not a mountain pass. The bodice was reinforced with steel stays, cinched so tight it had likely been a struggle to breathe even before she started her flight. "I have to cut you out of this," Silas said. He felt a flicker of the old code, the one that told a man to respect a lady's modesty. But she was dying in front of him. He reached for his hunting knife, a blade he'd forged himself. He turned her over onto her side. The back of the dress was a complex, the silk groaned. The tension was so great, the laces snapped like guitar strings. "It's too tight," she whispered again, her voice a ghost of a sound. "I can't breathe." Silas worked his way down to the corset beneath. This was the true prison, whalebone and reinforced canvas, tightened by someone who wanted her miniature, someone who wanted her fragile. As he sliced through the final cord at the base of her spine, something happened. The garment didn't just loosen, it burst, and with it, a sound filled the cabin that made Silas's heart stop. Clatter, chime, shimmer. It sounded like ice falling on a frozen pond. Dozens of small, hard objects tumbled out from the hidden lining of the corset, spilling over the buffalo robes and bouncing onto the wooden floorboards. Silas froze. He looked down. There, in the flickering amber light of the fire, were diamonds. They weren't set in gold. They weren't polished for a necklace. They were raw, heavy stones, dozens of them, some the size of a man's thumbnail. They caught the firelight, throwing jagged sparks of white and blue against the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. A fortune, a king's ransom. The woman let out a long, shuddering breath. Her lungs expanded fully for the first time in days. She collapsed back against the furs, her eyes closing, her body finally going limp. Silas stood there, knife in hand, surrounded by a shower of stolen light. He looked at the diamonds, then at the girl, then at the door. He knew one thing for certain. Stones like that didn't belong to a girl in a silk dress. They belonged to men who would kill an entire territory to get them back. The storm outside was getting louder, but for the first time in 12 years, Silas Thorne realized the wind wasn't his biggest problem. The night passed in a blur of shadows and heat. Silas gathered the diamonds. He didn't count them. He didn't want to know the number. He put them in an old iron tobacco tin and shoved it under a loose floorboard near the stove. He sat in his rocking chair, the Winchester across his lap. He watched her. Around 3 a.m, she stirred. She didn't scream when she saw him. She just watched him with those wide, intelligent eyes. They were the color of the sea before a gale. "You're the rancher," she said. Her voice was raspy but steady. "I'm a man who owns a patch of dirt," Silas replied. "You're the woman who nearly died on it." She looked down at herself. The shredded blue silk, the buffalo robes. She felt her waist, realizing the corset was gone. Her hand darted to where the lining had been. "They're in a tin," Silas said, "under the floor. I don't care about the stones, Mississippi, but I care about the men who are going to come looking for them." She leaned back, a bitter smile touching her lips. "He won't come himself. He'll send the ones who enjoy the hunt." "Who is he?" "The man I was supposed to marry," she said. "Senator Morehouse. He calls them his investments. I call them blood money. He's been stripping the mines in the South, hiding the yield from the government, preparing for a war he thinks is coming. I took them because they were the only thing he loved more than power." Silas didn't say anything for a long time. He knew the name Morehouse, a man with a long reach and a short temper. "My name is Clara," she said. "Silas, you should tell me to leave, Silas, as soon as the sun comes up." Silas looked at the window. The frost was thick, crystalline patterns blooming across the glass. "The sun isn't coming for 3 days, Clara. There's a wall of snow between us and the rest of the world. For now, we're the only 2 people left on Earth." She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the scars on his hands. She saw the way he gripped the rifle. Not like a hunter, but like a man who had seen the worst things humanity had to offer and decided to walk away from it. "You've been in a war," she whispered. "I've been in several," Silas said. "Some of them hadn't even started yet." He stood up and walked to the stove. He poured a cup of coffee, black, bitter, and hot. He handed it to her. "Drink. You'll need your strength, because when that snow stops falling, the world is going to come knocking on that door, and I suspect they won't be bringing a wedding ring." If you're still here, listening to the wind howl against Silas Thorne's cabin, then you're the kind of person who knows that out here, in the West, your past is never as far behind you as you think. Silas thought he'd found peace in the mountains, but a shower of diamonds just proved that trouble can find a man even in a blizzard. What would you do? Would you hand the stones over and hope for mercy? Or would you stand your ground for a stranger? Before we find out what happens when the senator's men reach the high country, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon. Out here, we tell the stories that the history books forgot. Stories of grit, honor, and the high price of freedom. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. I read every one of them. Now, let's get back to the mountain. The snow is beginning to thin. 3 days. That's how long the peace lasted. For 3 days, they lived in a strange, quiet domesticity. Clara helped him mend harness leather. She learned how to handle a skillet over a wood flame. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't talk about the diamonds. They talked about the way the light hit the larches in the morning. They talked about the horses. Silas found himself listening for the sound of her breath. No longer shallow and panicked, but steady. It gave the cabin a heartbeat. But on the 4th morning, the wind died. The sky cleared to a piercing, cruel blue. Silas was on the porch, checking the horizon with his brass spyglass. He saw them, 5 riders. They weren't struggling through the snow. They were moving with purpose, their horses high-stepping, their long coats flapping like the wings of carrion birds. "They're here," Silas said, stepping back inside. Clara stood by the table. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked cold. "The one in the lead. Does he have a white hat?" Silas looked again. "No, a black one, and a duster with a fur collar." "That's Miller," she said. "The senator's shadow. He doesn't take prisoners. Silas, please, take the tin. Take the horses. Go out the back coolly. You don't owe me your life." Silas didn't answer. He walked to the corner. He looked at her. "Can you shoot?" She reached into the folds of her now tattered dress and pulled out a small, pearl-handled derringer. Silas shook his head. He handed her a Colt .44 from his belt. "That's for they get close. If they stay far, you stay behind the chimney. Do you understand?" She nodded. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the heavy iron. Silas stepped out onto the porch. He didn't hide. He sat in his rocking chair, the Winchester leaning against his leg, and waited. The riders pulled up 50 yards out. The snow was still deep, making their horses restless. Miller, the man in the fur-collared duster, pushed his hat back. He had a face like a hatchet, all sharp angles and no soul. "Thorne," Miller shouted. His voice carried in the thin air. "We know she's in there, and we know what she took. You're a man with a clean record. Silas, don't ruin it for a thief." Silas didn't move. "She didn't steal anything, Miller. She just recovered some lost property. Now you're trespassing, and I'm a real stickler for boundaries." Miller laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "You're one man with an old rifle. We're 5 men who get paid by the kill. Think on it." "I have thought on it," Silas said. He reached down and picked up a small, charred piece of wood from the porch ash bucket. He tossed it into the snow. "That's the line. You cross it, and the conversation is over." Miller's smile vanished. He looked at his men. They were already spreading out, their hands hovering over their holsters. "Kill the man," Miller ordered. "Bring the girl and the stones. Burn the rest." The first man spurred his horse forward. He was a young kid, maybe 20, looking for a reputation. He crossed the line. Silas didn't reach for his rifle. He reached for a thin hemp cord tucked under the arm of his chair. He pulled it. Boom. The wood pile to the left of the riders erupted. Silas had buried a pound of blasting powder beneath it. The explosion didn't kill anyone, but it sent a geyser of pine logs and frozen earth into the air. The horses went wild, bucking and screaming. In the confusion, Silas leveled the Winchester. Crack! The young kid fell from his saddle before he could even draw. Crack! Another rider's horse went down, pinning the man's leg. Inside. Silas yelled to Clara. He dove through the door just as a volley of leads shredded the porch railing. He slammed the heavy oak bar into place. "Behind the chimney," he commanded. The cabin became a drum of noise. Bullets thudded into the thick cedar logs. Miller's men were professionals. They moved to the blind spots, trying to find a gap in the chinking. "Silas!" Clara screamed. A man was trying to come through the window, his heavy boot shattering the glass. Silas didn't hesitate. He swung above the Winchester, a crushing blow that sent the man reeling back into the snow. Then there was silence. It was the most dangerous kind of silence, the kind that meant they were changing tactics. Silas looked at Clara. She was huddled by the stones of the hearth, the Colt held in both hands. She was trembling, but her eyes were locked on the door. "They're going to use fire," Silas whispered. Sure enough, a minute later, a flickering light appeared through the gaps in the logs. They were bundling dry brush against the west wall. Silas looked at the floorboard where the diamonds were hidden. He looked at the woman who had risked everything to stop a senator's greed. "Clara," he said, "do you trust me?" "Yes," she said without a second's hesitation. "There's an old root cellar under the cot. It leads to a crawl space that comes out in the creek bed. It's tight and it's cold, but it's stone. Fire won't touch you there." "What about you?" Silas picked up 2 remaining jars of black powder. He gave her a small, sad smile, the first one he'd felt in years. "I've got a chimney to defend. Now go. Take the tin." She didn't want to go. He saw it in her eyes. But she knew that if she stayed, they both died. She grabbed the tin, slipped into the cellar hatch, and was gone into the dark. Silas waited until the smoke began to curl through the floorboards. The west wall was a sheet of flame now. The heat was becoming unbearable. Outside, Miller was shouting, "Come out, Thorne. Die like a man or die like a rat." Silas walked to the center of the room. He dumped the black powder onto the table, right under the main support beam. He laid a trail of it toward the back door. He opened the back door just an inch. He saw Miller and his last 2 men standing near the woodpile, guns leveled, waiting for him to bolt. "You want the diamonds, Miller?" Silas yelled. He took a final match, struck it against his thumbnail, and dropped it into the powder trail. Silas didn't run out the back. He dove into the root cellar, slamming the heavy iron-reinforced hatch just as the world turned into thunder. The explosion took the roof off the cabin. It turned the dry cedar into 1,000 flaming arrows. The force of it blew out the walls, collapsing the structure in a roar of orange and gold. From the stone crawl space, Silas felt the earth shake. He felt the heat sear the air. He waited. When he finally pushed his way out into the creek bed, the sun was beginning to set. The cabin was a blackened skeleton, glowing in the dusk. He saw 3 bodies in the snow. Miller was one of them, his fur-collared duster scorched, his eyes staring at a sky he'd never reach. Silas coughed, his lungs burning. He looked around. "Clara," he called. His voice was a wreck. "Clara." From behind a stand of frost-covered willows, a shape moved. She was covered in soot. Her dress was ruined beyond repair. But she was standing. She was holding the iron tin in one hand and the Colt in the other. She looked at the ruins of his home. "Silas, your ranch. Everything you had." Silas walked over to her. He took the heavy pistol from her shaking hand and tucked it back into his belt. He looked at the blackened timbers. "It was just wood and memories, Clara," he said. "I'm tired of living with both." She looked at the tin of diamonds. "We can go anywhere. We can take these to the authorities in the capital. We can finish what I started." Silas looked toward the south. The trail was open. The senator was still there, but now he was a man with a secret that had legs. "I reckon I've got one more war in me," Silas said. He walked to the barn, which had survived the blast. He led out 2 horses, the bay and his own steady roan. He helped her up into the saddle. No corset this time. No silk. Just a woman who could finally breathe. As they rode away from the smoking ruins of the Thorne Ranch, the first stars began to poke through the Montana sky. The diamonds were still in the tin, but as Silas looked at the woman riding beside him, he realized they weren't the most valuable thing he'd found in the snow. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a man who's lost everything and a woman who has nothing left to lose. Silas and Clara didn't know what was waiting for them in the city, but they knew they wouldn't be facing it alone. Out here in the West, stories don't end when the fire goes out. They just change shape. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that some things are worth more than diamonds, give this video a like. It helps us keep the campfire burning. And tell me in the comments, if you found a fortune in a blizzard, would you keep it and run, or would you use it to burn the house down? I'm truly grateful for every one of you who listens to these tales. Take care of yourselves, take care of your neighbor, and we'll see you on the next trail.